why don't we move to this interesting article by Jeremy Waldron that speaks to much of the things that we were mentioning before. I mean, you know, Jeremy Waldron is a philosopher of law mainly who teaches at NYU, and he published in 2012 a book that I criticized in my book on dignity. His book is on dignity, my book is not on dignity. This book is called Dignity, Ranks and Rights, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. And this is his last take on this concept of dignity, in particular human dignity, that he has been focusing on in the last, I would say, decades. In fact, it's a fantastic piece of scholarly literature because he's extremely knowledgeable, besides being extremely sharp and rigorous as a philosopher. So, as a general point about this article, I'd like to say that he pretends, to a certain extent, not to take side with any of the theses he discusses here, or not. His main point seems to be not that of conveying a well-defined philosophical thesis, as much as that of showing the difficulties that go with the attempt to ground human rights in human dignity, which is pretty much what the Orthodox usually want to do, and for what is worth and important, what also I want to do. He starts with something we should by now all be familiar with, that is the importance, at least in the preambles, that each of the major human rights documents assigns to human dignity. As he puts it, we are told in the preamble of the International Covenant on Civic and Political Rights that the rights it contains, quote, derive from the inherent dignity of the human person. And pretty much the same is said by the cognate International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, because it says that recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice and peace in the world. So again, human dignity is the foundation of things human rights usually protect: freedom, justice and peace in the world. Now, while related, Waldron rightly points out these two these two sentences are not saying exactly the same things, because the first one is stronger, seems really to introduce a relationship between human dignity and human right, as if you can infer human rights from human dignity, whereas the second one is looser, in a sense, is simply establishing a correlation on the one hand between, on the one hand, human dignity and the inalienable rights of all the members of the human family and certain moral goods we care about: freedom, justice and peace. But most importantly, the second formulation puts at the same level human dignity and the inalienable rights of all members of the human family, as if there were no logical distinction between human dignity and these inherent rights that we have, in the same way in which it was suggested in the first formulation. And this less, this formulation that does not introduce an inference stricto sensu from human dignity to human rights is also confirmed by the preamble of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that, for example, Article 1 says that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. So again, dignity and rights seem to be at the same logical level as opposed to one grounding the other. Now, are these different in terminological choices, if you want, or in the way of expressing of the founding fathers, expressing themselves of the founding fathers of the culture of human rights? Maybe not. But I guess that what Waldron wants to say is that we need what he's going to deliver in this paper. One of the things he's going to deliver in this paper, and that is some clarification on what we mean by a foundation of human rights, because there may be different ways of offering a foundation of human rights. So part of the conceptual analysis he offers is precisely on explaining whether by the foundation of human rights we really mean, okay, now I want X, and from X I want to infer Y, Z, W, and so on and so forth, which is the strong notion of derivation, and is almost an analytic inference from one concept to others, or whether we are, by foundation of human rights, want to mean or may mean, or we better mean something less strict and rigid as this idea of formal inference from one concept to another. Okay, before we move to that, and focusing a little bit on dignity, another thing that Waldron says, and I think is right in pointing that out, is that both covenants and the declaration make an appeal to dignity in the preamble, but then they also make dignity part of the things that are protected by human rights. So, for example, the Article 10 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights says all persons deprived of their liberty shall be treated with respect for the inherent dignity of the human person. So notice, now dignity is no longer the things from which you derive whatever human rights you may have. Now dignity is part of the content of some of the human rights that are listed at this level. So, but some of these human rights have dignity as their content. Now, is that a contradiction? I mean, is it okay to use the same concept both as a foundation of human rights as the content of some of the human rights? Waldron says no, it's not a it's not a contradiction, as some scholars say, and he gives an explanation of why it's not a contradiction. He says, for some of the areas covered by human rights, we may already know well what human dignity requires. So we know that in the area of religion, respecting the dignity of human beings entails giving everybody the freedom to choose which religion one wants to adopt. But in other areas, there might be no as straightforward benchmark as the one that I just mentioned. And so, I mean, for example, when we say prisoners should not be treated in a way that is incompatible with their dignity, we may be expressing a sort of constraint that we haven't yet, that we haven't been able yet to translate into specific directions and norms. So we don't know exactly what it means to treat prisoners with dignity, and so Waldron suggests that's why we find dignity also in the content of some of the human rights, because we are not certain of the exact implication of the dignity, in this case, of prisoners. And to make his point even clearer, he gives us an analogy. He says, members of the judiciary have a certain dignity in most legal systems. So judges have a set of dignities, so ways in which they should be treated, privileges if you want. We may say that marking and protecting the dignity of the judges is the foundation of many of the rights that they have. So that many of the privileges that judges have to do with the protection of their dignity, understood here in a specific sense, not the human dignity up there. So what are these privileges? Well, they have the right to appear in the judicial robes, so dressed in a certain way. They have, as one national constitution puts it, a right to remuneration consistent with the dignity of their office. You cannot pay a judge too little, because, among other things, he would be too much tempted to be bought by parties. At least that's the intuition. Similar things are said about politicians, and we know that doesn't work that well. And also, they have right not to suffer direct affronts to their dignity in court. So one of the privileges they have makes a direct reference to their dignity. And Waldron says the fact that this latter right, not to affront, not to face affronts to their dignity in court, the fact that this latter right refers more or less directly to their dignity does not preclude possibility that judicial dignity is the foundation of all their rights. So, in the same way in which we could say that, all the privileges that judges have refer or are derivable from an idea of judicial dignity that most legal systems have, so they deserve a special protection, even the kind of role that they have. The fact that we attribute all privileges that they have dependently on the attribution of this judiciary dignity does not prevent the possibility of introducing a reference to this this judiciary dignity also in one of the specific privileges that we attribute to it. So you cannot insult a judge in court, because that would be an affront to his dignity, to his role, and that's the parallel with what happens in human rights. You have dignity appearing up there as at least the official point of reference for the rights that documents specify, but you also find dignity mentioned in the content of some of the human rights, and there is no contradiction in that. Okay, back to the question of pluralism that Darley was mentioning before. Waldron says, okay, so dignity, even if there is no contradiction, dignity is still a good candidate for the foundation of human rights. We might not want to neglect, at the outset at least, the possibility that dignity might turn out to be foundational for some rights, but not for all. Maybe we should say that there are all sorts of rights with all sorts of foundation. So, for example, it's possible that free speech has one sort of foundation, that human treatment for detainees, for prisoners, has a different foundation, the right to education another foundation, this pluralism of values that might ground different areas of human rights. Waldron says the fact that dignity is important doesn't mean that other seemingly foundational values are also important. Dignity's importance does not necessarily make it into a master value, overshadowing every other value that might occupy a foundational role. Some rights may be based directly on liberty and autonomy, without regard to the place those ideas have in turn in the analysis of dignity. Some might be based on equality and social justice. Some might even be based indirectly on utility. What could be a human right based on utility? I think that what you were mentioning before the beginning of class, the fourth generation of human rights, the rights of the environment, you might say that could have a utilitarian foundation, to the extent in which you think that it's okay to limit the rights that individuals, at least belonging to one generation, have for the sake of the well-being of the species in general, the whole species, perhaps in future generations. So even if utilitarianism and rights talk, and particularly human rights talk, do not seem to match very well with one another, this might be a good example of what Waldron is suggesting here, that perhaps we should not look for one overarching value that grounds all human rights, but that different sorts of consideration could be the grounds of different areas of human rights. Now, again, if I have to say something critical about that, it looks very prudent from a theoretical point of view, but again, not looking for this ultimate ground, in a sense, pushes you to show me why, for example, I have to concede free speech and freedom of the press and freedom of association and all sorts of civic rights you may think of to certain entities, humans, unless you show me why, their expression, unless you show me why these entities deserve to have the interest that they may have in exercising these rights be taken into consideration. But okay, that's my perhaps ultra-orthodox tendency that speaks in this case. Okay, and he mentions in support of this idea that we might need some pluralism in the foundation of human rights, the examples of certain amendments that have been added to constitutions, famously to the American constitutions, that could hardly be conceived as derived from one normative value that we always have in mind when we add new rights in constitutional documents. So the right not to have troops in your courtyard, that is one of the amendments of the of the American Constitution, Waldron says, is hardly linkable to human dignity. At least the linkage is not immediately apparent, not to mention the subsequent amendments about the elections to the Senate, legality of the income tax, reduction of voting age to 18 from 21 to 18, and so on. Waldron says, if you want to make sense of these rights merely in terms of, oh yeah, right, in order to protect the dignity of human beings, I have to lower the age in which you can vote from 21 to 18. Go figure. It's probably difficult. But of course, reduction of voting age from 21 to 18 is not a human right. It's just, a right that appears in the American Constitution. It's not perhaps not accidentally. There is no human right to vote when you are 18. Okay, let's leave that aside. Let's move to the more interesting part of Waldron paper. This part about definitional difficulties, as he calls it. So, if he need to show now difficulties. What's difficult about defining human dignity? Well, of course, first thing that comes to mind is too vague. What do we mean by human dignity? This jurist, Oscar Schachter, observed that there is no explicit definition of human dignity in any of the documents that we have been mentioning. Now, the reason that Schachter thinks this is the case is that it is intrinsically vague. It's a concept that is intrinsically untractable. He uses this expression that is pretty much a sort of soft, amorphous concept, and precisely because it has this intrinsic vagueness, the founding fathers of the human rights culture never defined human dignity. And if we don't have, however, if we are not clear about what human dignity is, then the idea of deriving human rights from a vague concept might not be a good idea. Christopher McRudden, editor of this another gigantic volume, Understanding Human Dignity, that came out in 2012, argued that this lack of definition is actually a political choice. I mean, it's a strategic choice on the part of the founding fathers for the reason I've given you. We don't want to say what human dignity is because this might generate disagreements among peoples. I mean, if you give me this list of human rights as an expression of the idea that human beings are children of God, I mean, if I don't believe in God, why should I take seriously these human rights? If you give me this list of human rights as an expression of an idea of human dignity in terms of respect for the only entities that are capable of moral behavior, and I'm not a Kantian, why should I take seriously human rights? So McRudden thinks lack of specificity in the definition of human dignity that we found in official documents was a strategic, conscious choice on the part of the drafters of the human rights documents, who did not want to encourage disagreement among peoples. Now, whatever the reason is why human dignity is not defined in the official documents, whether it is intrinsically vague and impossible to determine, or whether it may be specified in certain way, but we decide not to do it because we don't want to encourage disagreement. It is certainly the case that dignity is not defined in any of the human rights document, at least not I think in any of the human rights documents we know it. Major, minor conventions, declarations, treaties, and so on and so forth. Now, the reason for this could be that, as in other areas, sometimes you hear, for example in bioethics, is that human dignity is squishy. I confess that I learned this word in English by reading Waldron's paper. Squishy means sort of a formless piece of mud that it's something that you don't even know.
That plays a lot of species.
Oh yeah? Okay, well then, yeah. Anyway, so you get the idea. Yeah, I mean...
It's almost onomatopoeic.
Yeah, you give the form you like.
Could be onomatopoeic, yes, I didn't think of it. But anyway, the idea is that it's so amorphous that it takes any form that you like.
Right, yes.
Exactly. Now, one interesting position, among these many definitional difficulties that we may have, perhaps the position that Waldron most likes, as I told you, it's never clear what position he endorses. He simply gives you a list of difficulties in this business of grounding human rights on human dignity, but it's not clear the one he endorses, the one he likes most. I think that in this case, the difficulty or the solution of the difficulty he likes most is this, that it is true that dignity is pretty vague and difficult to define, but still this should not be a reason to disqualify dignity as a potential foundation of human rights, pretty much because both the definition of human rights and the definition of human dignity are a work in progress. So basically the intuition is that we understand human rights today after 70 years from the Universal Declaration in a way, in a better way, in a more articulated way than in the way in which it was understood 70 years ago. What happened in between is of course a lot of activism in the name of human rights, a lot of historical facts that happened in the name of human rights. For example, remember self-determination against colonial powers, done in the name of human rights, what Ignatieff calls the juridical revolution. So once these rights were put down, even in a non-binding document such as the Declaration, because the Declaration is a declaration of rights, there is no legal force behind it, but once the superpowers, the colonial powers had put forward this list of rights, including the right of self-determination for all peoples, colonies used this language to justify their movement towards independence. So what happened in 7 years was a lot of activism of human rights, there was a lot of jurisprudence on human rights. Remember that there is a human rights court in Europe that issues sentences that of course contribute to the understanding of human rights, because that's what usually happens with norms. Now, Waldron says, on the one hand there is a growing and improving understanding of human rights along the lines that I've just described, and on the other hand there may be similar things going on with human dignity. That is, there might be a dialectic between these two poles, and this speaks to another thesis that Waldron implicitly, silently endorses in this paper, which is that's exactly how he sees the relation between human dignity and human rights, not as one is there and from there you infer human rights as in the previous scheme that I had on the board, but it's more like they are pretty much at the same logical level. They influence one another and they correct each other, sort of reflective equilibrium between those two. But again, the point we are making today is that the vagueness of human dignity is not a sufficient reason for disqualifying it from any foundational role that we may want to attribute to it. So there is not, this is not inconsistent with dignity. I mean, the fact that it's vague, it's not inconsistent with dignity operating as a foundation for rights, for our understanding of human rights, no more than 70 years old in this modern incarnation, is a work in progress also. There is still no settled consensus about what it means to say that the right to F is a human right, apart from the minimum claim that it is a right that all humans are now conceived to have. The claim that dignity is the foundation of rights does not point us to a determinate premise, to a determinate definition. Rather, it instructs us to pay attention to questions about dignity in trying to address questions about right. It implicates the one line of inquiry in the other. So, the lack of determinacy in the content of human dignity is not sufficient to exclude the possibility of saying, look, whatever you may find out about human dignity is going to be relevant for human rights, which means to keep some foundational role for this concept despite its squishy nature. Okay. What else do we have of interest? Okay, yeah. Another reason why, well, I guess we already mentioned this, but another reason why defining human dignity is a difficult task might not have to be with an intrinsic difficulty with the concept, but quite simply with the fact that it's a contested concept. So a little bit the point that was made before. We may disagree about what human dignity means. I mean, if we look at the history of ideas, not surprisingly, we don't find one definition of human dignity. There is a proliferation of dignitarian theories. There is, as Waldron lists, a Kantian theory based on autonomous moral capacity. There is the Catholic theory based on human dignity created in the image of God. I don't know why it's Catholic and not Christian. I mean, do Protestants have a different idea of human dignity? I don't think so. Anyway, there is a theory developed by me and Waldron, and others about dignity as a status rather than a value, and we'll see what that means. And there is a theory of dignity developed by Ronald Dworkin in Justice for the Hedgehogs. Now, these are rival accounts, they are incompatible accounts of human dignity. So, the suggestion here is that the reason why we don't have a definition is that it's contested concept, yeah, and if that is the case, again, we may reconsider whether we want to have human dignity as the foundation of human rights. Now, at this point, we might want to ask whether human rights really need a foundation, which could be dignity, which could be another thing, which could be another concept, doesn't matter. But do they really need a foundation to begin with? As we know by now, some authoritative philosophers, especially belonging to the political school, think that this is not the case. We don't really need a foundation of human rights, because human rights have their own life independently of a foundation. So George Kateb puts this point without endorsing it, because he has a foundation of human rights, but he puts the point by saying, why make trouble by defending rights at length and make worse trouble by claiming that human dignity is the basis or part of the basis for human rights? Theoretical defense invites philosophical skepticism, which is sometimes useful to stimulate thought, but there is these days not very much theory, though there is some that come out and say that human dignity and human rights are, in Jeremy Bentham's phrase, nonsense upon stilts, and that the idea of human dignity adds yet more nonsense. So, if you want to defend human rights, perhaps you should stop talking about human dignity, because those who are not convinced by human rights, and you say, okay, now I'm going to show you that human rights are truly normative. Let's talk about human dignity. That's even worse, because disagreement is even bigger. And therefore, let's not follow this path if we care about human rights, because this is not going to get us anywhere. Not to mention that lawyers and judges disagree back and forth about the way in which dignity may help us to define certain basic rights. Here, the famous example that he mentions a little bit later, but I think it's relevant, there was this famous ruling by the German Supreme Court on the possibility for the German Air Force to strike down an airplane that was hijacked by terrorists, to prevent the fact that terrorists would use that airplane to do something like in 9/11, okay, to hit a building and kill 300 people. So the question was, the premise of the Supreme Court intervention was that there was a law that would allow the German Air Force to strike down that airplane in order thereby killing the of course hijacked, so civilian, innocent people in the airplane. So the law would say, yes, the Air Force in this extreme condition is allowed to throw a missile at that hijacked airplane in such a way that, yes, we lose the lives of these poor victims who are in the airplane, we would die anyway, but at least we save the lives of the target of the terrorist, so the building or whatever target they might have. Now the Supreme Court said, no, that is not constitutional, because you are using the passengers as means for the end of someone else, so the ends of protecting the lives of the targeted civilians, and therefore they made that law unconstitutional. Waldron's suggestion here is, you see, this is a contested interpretation of dignity. The German Supreme Court, not surprisingly, had a strong Kantian notion of human dignity. So, to take seriously the dignity of human being is never to make anyone a means for the end of someone else, and killing these passengers through a deliberative act of force on the part of the government would exactly mean to transform them as means for the protection of the lives of other people. Now, you may disagree with this decision. I disagree, and I think that Kant has nothing to do with it, and I think that Kant would say it's a wrong decision, because what you are discussing is whether these people who would die anyway are to be killed by a national authority to prevent other people from dying, which seems to me is clearly the case. I mean, the only objection you might have is that you really never know whether, you know, what if a brave passenger within the airplane does something like it was done, you know, the last movie by Clint Eastwood, you know, that show how these 3 Americans in that train in Paris prevented the terrorist attack by, you don't know about it? I mean, the last movie of Clint Eastwood is all about, not surprisingly, he likes heroism, especially if it's American heroism. So it is about this thing that happened, I think, 3 years ago, 2 years ago, something like that. 2 years ago, more than 3 years ago. Okay, there were 3 American, 3 American soldiers, not dressed as soldiers, but they were part of the American army, traveling in a train, I think, from Brussels to Paris. And there were terrorists in that train that at one point hijacked the train. I don't know what they wanted to do.
There was a terrorist with a
machine gun. Yeah.
Before he could start.
He wanted just to
shooting,
kill
he wanted
people.
just to kill
I
people.
see.
But actually, the real hero was a French teacher. First, so the guy tried to stop and got wounded, and then the 3 Americans jumped on him. But of course, these guys not very much relevant in
of course. Clint Eastwood
movie because he's not American, and most of all because he's an atheist.
But third of all, because he's French, I would say.
Yes, but the 3 guys, you know, saying God wanted us to be there, while the other guy says, I don't give a damn about this. So it's an interesting. He is the real hero. He really, at least, alerted the others that there was this problem.
Yeah. Okay, so now I forgot why I mentioned these.
The consequences.
You don't know. I mean, what if a passenger in that airplane had done something similar? This French teacher and these 3 American soldiers and stopped the hijack. At that point, you know, nobody would have died. So, but this was not the argument that the Supreme Court made, which I think is the only sensible argument to make. It made the bad Kantian argument saying. We cannot use the lives of the passengers as means for protecting the lives of someone else. So why are we mentioning this? We are mentioning this to show that one of the difficulties with human dignity we have is that since it is a contested concept and there may be legitimate yet incompatible definitions of human dignity, depending on the one you prefer, you have different rights. You end up with rights that are very different. So there are consequences that follow from your prioritizing one definition of human dignity over another. Finally, you might think, well, look, if the concept of human dignity is so untractable, is so intrinsically difficult to determine, at least in a fairly unanimous way, why don't we stop inquiring into this notion? Why don't we stop thinking about what we should conceive of as human dignity, especially because, as I said repeatedly, the practical consequences of abandoning this field of inquiry do not seem to be huge. Human rights have their own life, and they do what they do for us and for our lives, little or big, it doesn't matter, quite independently of this difficulty in defining human dignity. Now Waldron answers, well, if that were the case, then we should stop doing quantum physics, basically. I mean, it's very, there are no practical consequences, at least so far, of quantum physics. There are no practical application of quantum physics, and yet we spend millions of euros paying physicists to keep doing quantum physics, because, as we know, in the history of knowledge in general, what may seem to be completely non-practical today can later become extremely important for technological development, for meeting human needs, assuming that technology is about meeting human needs.